Well, welcome to Literacy at the Center, where we believe every child has the right to read at or above grade level, independently and proficiently by the end of third grade. Today, I'm your host, Candice LaConti, and I am an Associate Education Consultant with the Center for Literacy Research and Reading Success at the Connecticut State Department of Education. Today's guest is Dr. Michael Coyne, one of the founding members of the Connecticut Literacy Model. He is the department head of educational psychology and a professor of special education at the University of Connecticut.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's so great to be here. I'm so excited about this podcast.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the work that you've been doing recently here in Connecticut?
Yeah, sure. So like you said, I'm a faculty member at the MEAG School of Education, and my main job is to help prepare teachers who are going to be future special educators. So we're really committed to that work of preparing teachers to, be good teachers of reading. And I have to say that the work that I've had the opportunity to be a part of with the Connecticut Center and the Connecticut Literacy Model, I feel has been some of the most important and meaningful work that I've gotten a chance to do. So, really working with the center and you and everybody at the state level to really think about how to provide the professional learning and the coaching and the supports to schools and districts and teachers across the state and helping to provide really high quality, effective reading instruction intervention to students has been a really, really important work and something that I've valued so much. In my background, my research is, developing and evaluating effective strategies and instruction and intervention for students with reading difficulties and reading disabilities like dyslexia. And so, the research part is something I'm really excited about also, but the applied work, particularly in Connecticut, is really, like, to me, what's the most important thing that I get to do.
We love your passion. It's wonderful. So it's inspiring for us all. The Connecticut Literacy Model highlights 5 systemic priority areas, which you well know: leadership, assessment, professional learning, tiered instruction, and family engagement. And I'm wondering if you could share one of these areas that you believe is particularly critical right now and explain why it stands out to you.
Yeah, so I'm excited to get to talk about tiered instruction. So that's what I'm hoping to talk about today. And, it's something that to me is a really, really powerful way to think about how we help kids in school. So, at its sort of most basic level, I think of tiered instruction as a school-wide system for providing every student with the level of support they need to be a successful reader. And this is really based on our understanding that one size doesn't fit all with how we think about teaching reading, so that we really need to be able to tailor supports to the specific reading needs of each student. And so when you think about tiered instruction, as you sort of said earlier, right, like oftentimes we think about it as MTSS or multi-tiered systems of support, or sometimes response to intervention or response to instruction. And, it's also very closely aligned with Connecticut's SRBI, scientifically based or scientific research-based interventions. But to me, the main thing that kind of ties all those conceptual frameworks together is this idea about how we organize schools to provide different levels of support to students in reading based on what their needs are. So again, that's, I think, the foundation of tiered instruction. And a lot of times we think about it as 3 tiers. So that tier 1 is that all students receive really high quality, evidence-based classroom reading instruction, as a matter of course. And that happens, in a classroom, and that, often consists of some whole class instruction, but also, differentiated small group instruction in the tier 1 classroom or in the classroom. And, in Connecticut, supported by, a really strong core reading program, like the programs that are on the approved list in Connecticut. But we know from research, and we just know because of our experiences in schools, that that's not going to be enough for every student to be successful. I mean, we hope that that's what up to 70–80% of students need to become successful readers. But we know there's like a significant proportion of those students that are going to need something beyond just high quality classroom reading instruction. So in a tiered system of support, schools provide supplemental tier 2 reading intervention to those students that are at risk for experiencing reading difficulties, or that we know are not going to make the kind of progress that we want with just tier 1 instruction. And so tier 2 intervention, we think about it often as small group intervention for students that need something more. And then tier 3 is that there's going to be hopefully a small number of students in schools that are going to need something that's more highly individualized, so that even classroom instruction and then additional small group intervention might not be enough. And so we think about kind of highly individualized plans for them. And, that can be sometimes connected to special education with an IEP. It doesn't have to, but oftentimes, students that have that level of need, it makes sense, or it aligns with having them have the protections of, special education services, so that they are ensured that they get the individualized education plan that they need. But special education doesn't fit neatly in any one of these kind of tiered categories. So in the time that we have, I was sort of thinking that I was talk a little bit more about the power of sort of tier 2 or supplemental intervention. Could spend a lot of time talking about tier 1 classroom instruction or tier 3 individualized supports, but to me, I think tier 2 intervention is really a place that can make a huge difference in outcomes of students, and something that schools are able to do, and that schools in Connecticut have the resources and the expertise and the knowledge to be able to provide really high quality tier 2 intervention for students. And so a couple of things that I like to think about when thinking about tiered supports in general, but more the small group intervention piece is just some things to keep in mind. Is one of them is that all of tiered instruction, or MTSS, has a prevention focus. So the goal is to provide supports early to students, instead of waiting for that until students are really far behind and have so much ground to catch up. So the idea is to kind of identify students early who are at risk or who may be falling behind, and we do that based on data. So tiered instruction is really closely aligned with the assessment component of the Connecticut Literacy Model, so that schools are doing screening or benchmarking assessments on all students 3 times a year. And, I always like to think of those as like similar to vital signs in health. Like those are really quick measures that just give us a sense of the overall reading health of students. It's sort of like, your blood pressure, your temperature, that those things look okay, then, pretty good case that like there's not something going on that we're missing. But if some of those signs are elevated, if you have a temperature, if your blood pressure is high, then that's information about maybe we should dig a little deeper, collect more information, and maybe try some strategies that can try to decrease those risk factors. So by having this kind of regular... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love that analogy. If the blood pressure was elevated, for example, I like how you're saying, we would dig in a little bit to that. We wouldn't just let it go. And I think traditionally, for so many years in education, we might say, oh, we'll wait till they get into 3rd grade. Sometimes they'll just mature out of it.
Right, exactly. So this idea of a prevention focus is that we don't just wait and see what happens, right? When we have these early indicators that there may be, that there are some risk factors, we want to provide, increase the levels of support, as soon as possible, so that instead of waiting and seeing what happens, we're really proactive and thinking about kind of providing these prevention supports rather than only thinking about kind of remediation, I guess. So that's a great point. So with these types of systems in place, schools are able to identify students early and then really provide them with small group supplemental supports to be able to, accelerate their reading performance so that they don't fall behind. The other thing about the
Yeah.
sort of screening process is that, it doesn't just rely on, say, teacher or parent referral. Like in some schools in the past, it was just if you were lucky enough to happen to be in a classroom where a teacher is really on top of things and, understands that the student might be needing some extra support and is engaged in the referral process. The idea of having a school-wide screening system and benchmarking system that happens multiple times of the year is that it's almost like a fail-safe mechanism where no kids slip through the cracks, that there doesn't matter that if you're lucky enough to be, in a classroom where someone's on top of things, or that if you have a family member that's, really understands the system, this is going to catch all the kids that might need this kind of supplemental support. And, that's sort of this other piece of it being organized school-wide, so that there's, it's not up to individual teachers to figure out how to do this on their own, right? There's a school-wide leadership team that really understands things about scheduling and how to make sure that these types of supplemental interventions are consistent across the school, that there's people who are experts at being able to deliver it. So instead of an individual teacher kind of figuring out how to do this on their own, the school system is really set up to support all kids and all teachers to make this happen.
So it's a real team approach.
Yeah, it's a team systems approach, which I think is just one of the really powerful things about tiered instruction in general, is that it really takes advantage of the whole school capacity and infrastructure to be able to do these things. Because it's super hard, and especially for relying on individual teachers to do this. I think that's sort of too much to put on an individual teacher to figure out how to meet every student's individual need, where the power is in the kind of systems level approach to this also. So to me, I think one of the most really important things of supplemental intervention is that the whole goal of it is to increase the intensity of instruction. Sometimes we kind of think that these are students that need a whole different kind of instruction. And sort of what we know about reading is that, all students benefit from really high quality evidence-based instruction that's aligned with the science of reading. But some students just need that delivered at a higher level of intensity. So it's often the same kinds of strategies and the same content, but just more intensive. So intensity is really the key of tier 2. And that could mean more time. Well, sort of by definition has to mean more time, right? So time outside of tier 1, 30 minutes 3 times a week, 30 minutes 5 times a week, doing it more in a smaller group. So there's more opportunities for kids to practice and to get feedback, using really high quality instructional materials and programs, intervention programs that have evidence of success, dedicated interventionists who, are getting support for implementing this type of intervention at sort of high level. Sometimes it's more focused content, so might be focusing particularly on fluency or vocabulary or foundational skills, where tier 1 kind of is comprehensive everything. Tier 2 can be focused on more, specific content that's a need for certain groups of students. And also more progress monitoring, so really understanding if the intervention is being effective and if students aren't making the progress that we hope, being able to adjust interventions in sort of real time to make them as as effective as possible. So I think all of those things are really important kind of components of tiered systems and support in general, but tier 2 supplemental intervention in particular.
As you reflect on this, can you share a short story about tiered instruction that illustrates the importance of this work, kind of what you've described here?
Yeah, there's one sort of story that I always think about that kind of sticks out to me. And so we were doing a study or working with some schools in Connecticut. This was a while ago, but this was a study on vocabulary intervention for young kids in kindergarten. So the goal of the project was to identify kindergarten students that might be at risk based on early language and vocabulary screening measures. And then the intervention was providing these kindergarten students with small group intervention that was really focused on learning academic language and academic vocabulary through, really engaging story read alouds that just highlighted and focused on, really important vocabulary words and concepts in those stories, and then giving these students, a lot of opportunity to engage in rich dialogic discussions about the story and about their own experiences using these vocabulary. And we found really strong effects of that study on kids' vocabulary learning and their kind of understanding of what they were listening to. This wasn't reading at all. This was all kind of oral language kind of components. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was more of the kind of the effect that this had on the students that were involved and also the adults and the teachers in the building. So, some of the vocabulary words that these students were learning were, really pretty sophisticated words. I don't know, like enormous or persistent or contribute. And, because of this, the students that were doing this really felt empowered. I think they, felt like this was really powerful to sort of know these big words and to be able to use them in their conversation. So they were really excited about using vocabulary that they were learning as part of this throughout the day with their peers or with other teachers or administrators in the schools. They're saying things like, the piles of snow in the parking lot are enormous, or, I'm very persistent when I'm trying a new hard thing, or I'm really excited about contributing to our class's project. And so, teachers and administrators were just super impressed hearing these little kindergartners using this vocabulary, and not just kindergartners, but kindergartners that, were potentially in a place where they might be seen, as being less competent or feeling not great about themselves. And this changed the way the adults in the school thought about these students. And in fact, the principal at some point said to me that, this kind of process really made her, change her understanding of these students and, and sort of broaden her expectations about what they could accomplish. So I think this idea for this podcast about telling a story is really, important and, powerful because, we could talk about data a lot, but, the whole goal of all of these things is to really provide students with the skills they need to be successful. And that kind of relates to how they're feeling about themselves and their motivation and their confidence. And it changes adults' views of what's possible with students. And so the kind of whole cycle of, accelerating progress and doing it in a school setting with students, that you get the data changes, but you also, really kind of change the way students feel about themselves and how teachers and adults think about students.
Wow. I love that story that you shared because so many times in schools, very well-meaning educators, parents, the adults in the child's life, sometimes are hesitant to have children participate in tiered instruction, tier 2, tier 3 instruction. They're worried about a stigma. But what you just illustrated is that not only was this knowledge, these new skills, not only was that empowering for the students, but it really changed the perspective of the educators around them. So that's powerful.
Yeah, I know. It's something that I've always, it's been, I love that story. And I think it's a really great example of the power of tiered instruction and, what you get from being able to help accelerate students' progress in these kind of key areas.
For sure. Wow. Well, you've certainly convinced us about the power of tiered instruction. What's one immediate action step that districts and school leaders can take to strengthen the tiered instruction and K-3 literacy in their own environments?
Yeah, yeah. Well, first, I'm just going to say, because I forgot to say this earlier, but one of the things about tiered instruction, and particularly about small group supplemental reading intervention, is that we probably have more positive research on reading, small group reading intervention in K3 than in almost any other area of education, right? So we know that if you can do this in a school, that you're going to make a difference in kids' reading outcomes. The evidence is overwhelmingly positive around the benefits of providing small group intervention. And as part of the Connecticut Literacy Model, we were able to, do a very rigorous study here in Connecticut with schools that showed that, when the schools in Connecticut were able to provide this kind of supplemental support for students in K through 2 or K through 3, really made a difference in their reading outcomes. And so I think Connecticut's one of the few states that, has not just evidence from research that was done, by researchers, but also has research that was done as part of the Connecticut Literacy Model, that demonstrates that this works here in Connecticut with Connecticut schools and Connecticut teachers and Connecticut students. So that's something that I'm really proud about, that the center and the CTLM team has been able to do here in Connecticut. But kind of building off of what we know from the research, I think the one piece of advice that I would give to schools is, or immediate action step, is just to make sure it's happening. I think schools understand the importance of intervention and small group tier 2 intervention, and they probably have a plan in place for how that works, and they're trying to look at data. But with everything going on in schools, sometimes maybe the level of implementation, the level of intensity might not be where the hope might be. So I would say that really make sure it's happening when it's planned to happen, that interventions aren't getting pulled to do other things, that if it's supposed to be 30 minutes, it really is 30 minutes. The interventionists get the support they need to really implement with high levels, that they're implementing whatever program that they have with fidelity, that it really is significantly increasing the level of intensity of support for these students. Because in the studies where it hasn't worked, those seem to be the things that were lacking, which is it wasn't happening enough. It wasn't happening for the amount of time that it was supposed to happen. They weren't implementing a sort of consistent evidence-based program or strategy, or they were, but they weren't doing with fidelity. Great intentions and all the kind of things, like the plan was there, but the plan was just not implemented at the level of consistency and intensity that we know is needed to really make a difference with the student outcomes. So I think kind of really like paying attention to whether this is happening as it's supposed to and as it's intended.